great challenge of reaching a peace agreement with which we started the conference with Shai Feldman and Khalil Shikaki, and looking at President Obama's speech last night discussing the global focus on asymmetric conflicts and fighting terror organizations such as ISIS. It seems like the world is consumed, with this subject today, that more and more of the wars are not traditional conventional wars between two militaries, but are rather asymmetric conflicts in which one of the sides intentionally doesn't accept or recognize international law, much less tried to abide by it, in which they often meld among civilians, don't have the distinction of uniform, look like civilians, operate, store their weapons in civilian areas and fire among civilians, and therefore it creates an extremely difficult situation in terms of how militaries can fight these organizations successfully. And it's very interesting to even question whether wars, these kinds of wars, can actually be won at all. And it's very interesting because I think when Obama first came to power, he talked about destroying the Taliban in Afghanistan. And then over the years, he changed that goal from destruction to containment, and kind of maybe gave up on that initial ambitious goal. And we have the opposite going on perhaps now with ISIS, where perhaps we started, and some of the international actors started thinking they could maybe contain ISIS, to now, in the aftermath of the Paris attacks and other attacks that have spread, the language has very much changed to the need to destroy ISIS, right? And so the question is, to what extent is military defeat of these kind of groups even possible? And to what extent is it possible, especially for democracies? And democracies, do democracies have a kind of a special or unique or extra challenge in fighting these wars, right? Because simultaneously, when Israel was fighting Hamas in Gaza in 2008 in the Caste-led war, Sri Lanka was fighting its Tamil rebels, and Sri Lanka, not being a democracy, killed 20,000 people, kind of destroyed the Tamil movement, and in a sense was militarily victorious, right? We can see perhaps Saudi Arabia with its airstrikes in Yemen not necessarily having to worry about the restraints that democracies worry about. But Israel and the United States and other democracies, face a special challenge. And the question is, can they even be militarily victorious? What does that mean? Because from the get-go, most militaries around the world have the doctrine of deterrence, right? They have the main obligation of protecting their citizens, and in doing so, the strategy is often that if you're attacked, to punish the actor that has attacked you to the extent and with the force that will prevent them from ever attacking you again, right? This is what practically all militaries around the world, this is what their doctrine often relies on, which is deterrence. And you're not only going to deter someone who's attacked you from ever doing it again, but you're going to send a message to other actors who might even think about attacking you, that through this kind of punishment and severe dealing with an attacker, they will never do it again, right? This has been the common strategy. But when you're dealing with asymmetric wars and you're operating in the midst of civilian populations, you have on one hand the impetus that comes from the public for their country to do something to protect them, weighed against the needs for constraint in this kind of war. So right in the aftermath of attacks, in the Israeli case we see, once you have hundreds of rockets, dozens of rockets, an escalation of rockets, you have this uproar, especially from those people who are living in those border areas in the south, that the government is failing to protect them, and in a pressure to react militarily as a deterrent, right? Even in the U.S. now, which the public has seen as extremely war-weary after, over a decade of war in Afghanistan and years of war in Iraq, and Obama was elected upon kind of withdrawing from Iraq, we now see in in the aftermath of the growth of ISIS and the repeated attacks now globally on ISIS, that 53% of the American population apparently wants to send, boots on the ground or soldiers to Syria and Iraq once again. In the aftermath of the Paris attacks, we had the French government say that they're going to escalate in a dramatic way their airstrikes against ISIS, right? So I think every country which faces with attack, it faces this domestic pressure which leans towards kind of this deterrent escalation of military force. But on the other hand, again, as I'm saying, with these asymmetric wars, you have these countering forces which make it incumbent on these militaries to also show restraint. And where does those pressures from restraint come from? Right? They come from the growing emphasis and growing norm concerning international humanitarian law and its operation in these kinds of wars. And it comes from the dilemmas of questioning how you even measure military effectiveness, and therefore how do you, even when you make military inroads, have political victories or political effectiveness in these types of wars. And these are shaped more and more by media narratives and the sense of how legitimate a country is operating and so forth, that also influences how people measure the political effectiveness of the country's reaction in these kinds of asymmetric wars. So you have this extreme challenge of countries, including Israel, where on one hand you have these pressures for deterrence and to protect its citizens, and on the other hand, pressures for restraint and following international law, dealing with the aftermath of media narratives in terms of actually restraining your response in some way as well. And so more and more countries like Israel are finding themselves full of ambiguous situations and how to deal with abiding by international law, which is ambiguous in itself an interpretation in these conditions, and how you even measure whether you're militarily or politically effective in these kinds of situations. And I think in the end, I'll draw that to how our conference started in the beginning in terms of peace agreements, right? Because, especially because of a lack of a peace agreement contributes these continuing wars, whereas in the last 9 years alone, the 2006 Israeli war with Hezbollah, the 2008, 2012, 2014 wars between Israel and Hamas in Gaza, right? So on one hand, Khalil Shikaki was talking to us yesterday about a no war, no peace situation in the past 10 years between the Palestinian Authority and Israel. On the other hand, it certainly has been not a no war situation between Israel and Hamas, right, during this time period. And arguably, you can't be militarily victorious in these kinds of wars, and you can only make limited progress before you get the next war in these kinds of asymmetric wars, which calls to even a greater extent the need for an overall peace agreement that would hopefully weaken, if not moderate, Hamas as a consequence, right, because of the limitations of these kinds of wars. And that's highlighted even yesterday. The IDF Chief of Staff was saying there's a line that's a hairline between every time you get an attack from Gaza, whether it's going to stop there or it's going to lead to the next escalated war. He said this just yesterday. Yeah. I'm too loud. Okay, that's what I was scared of because I tend to project, is if I put it down, is that better? Okay, thanks for letting me know. Is this okay with everybody that I put it lower? And let me know if there's, I'm sorry? Up more? Here, okay. So I try to find a middle distance and keep my arm there and let me know if it's going up or down. So again, he said just yesterday, there's a line as thin as a hair that separates us from an incident that ends rocket fire in an open area to rocket fire that can lead to casualties and escalation, right? And so he says, okay, we've had about 15 months of prolonged quiet normality, but any day that can change, right? Because there were attacks just yesterday, or was it this morning, against Israeli vehicles on the other side of the Gaza border. Israel had a kind of tit-for-tat response, and that's usually what you get, is a kind of tit-for-tat response, and every couple of years it turns into this bigger war. But you never know for sure, right, when it's going to escalate and what's the least worst way of responding as these situations occur. So I think, one of the things that's restraining the impetus for deterrence, that's been a long-standing military doctrine, is international humanitarian law. And some say that this law kind of handicaps democracies and it doesn't allow them to actually be victorious in any of these wars, right? Which is the retreat from defeat to contain in Afghanistan. And often the statements, even within Israel, they're not about the aim of destroying Hamas, right? Because that would be too costly. So what is and the other side is saying, no, international law is much too flexible and it allows too many civilians to be killed, right? Now, what's very interesting in Israel, I think, is kind of a model for some of these discussions and norms of international humanitarian law. I had the privilege of being in several little conferences such as this in the IDC Herzliya on terrorism, counterterrorism, and it was very interesting. They had members of the International Red Cross there. They had international lawyers, they had prominent members of the Israeli military, and so you have members from kind of non-governmental organizations, human rights organizations, international lawyers in the military, all sitting around to try to see, well, given the international law we have and its ambiguities, how can we form a norm as to how to implement this without changing it? And of course, groups like the International Red Cross are very hesitant to change international law as they fear that it might become too loose or it might go in the wrong direction, right? So it's very interesting, I think, work going on in Israel right now that's trying to look at what is this norm as shaping international humanitarian law, and how can countries implement this kind of thing? Now, of course, one of the basis of international humanitarian law is the idea of proportionality and distinction, right? So that you have to distinct, that's what separates, right, Israel and the U.S. from terror organizations, and therefore you don't target non-combatants or civilians, and you make a distinction between them and military organizations. And of course, in that law, the idea of proportionality is that you have to weigh kind of the necessity of aiming at a military target with the potential costs of that. You can never target civilians. You have to minimize the cost to civilians. But then in order for it to be proportional, once you've done those things, you have to make sure that whatever kind of collateral costs they are, and it's always a difficult term, especially when we talk about people, that it's worth the military gain that you're getting from that, right? And so ultimately in international law, what's deemed proportional is subjective according to the military commander, right? It's his, often his, not many times her opinion, right, as to the necessity of the military target and whether the potential foreseen collateral damage is worth that, right? But in this sense, it's very ambiguous and subjective, right? There are no rules of the game in terms of, for any country, including Israel and the United States, as to what, am I being too loud again? Okay, so I have the opposite problem of all the other speakers. What, I'm sorry? Too fast too? Okay. Put it in the holder. Okay. Is this good? No, that's not loud enough. Okay, I'll speak with the same energy with it here. Is that good? Okay, because then I can have my natural tendency to project without breaking your ears. Okay. So this is a good, though. Yesterday people were complaining they couldn't hear. Now it's too loud. I guess we're finding our medium. One of the problems is it's all subjective, right? Which calls for a lot of ambiguity as to what you think is worth, right? What cost you think is worth gaining the military gain. And in weighing this too, what complicates this further is defining who is a civilian and who isn't a civilian. Do you have to be directly involved in the military organization? Do you have to be supporting the military organization? I mean, one question that highlights this is in the aftermath of the Paris attacks, you have this impetus among the United States and France and others to hit hundreds of trucks that are carrying oil. Maybe this goes back in a tangential way to the last lecture, to hit hundreds of trucks carrying oil to ISIS, which in a sense give them the economic, right, support and capacity to take over more territory and make havoc in the region and create instability in the region. So the question is, right, according to international humanitarian law, is that okay to hit trucks carrying gas? What if these truck drivers are civilians that aren't part of ISIS? What if they are part of ISIS, but they had no choice in driving these trucks? Is it civilian infrastructure, or is it military capacity that you're targeting, right? So for unless you're a military leader or are caught, with a bomb planning an attack, it's often questionable, right? And there's room for disagreement as to whether it's allowed under international humanitarian law or not. And then it's very, then it's questionable for targeted killings, right? What is allowed, what isn't allowed, how do you determine that? Now, Israel in some cases has been a model for trying to restrain and define kind of when this is acceptable. So I conducted a lot of preliminary interviews in Israel, with a lot of the IDF legal advisors that do international law in the IDF and advise these things. One of them was Daniel Reisner, and he put before the Israeli Supreme Court also the conditions under which narrowing when it would be appropriate, right? Some of those are when you can't arrest the person. Others are when you don't control the territory, right? So that maybe you can in Gaza because Israel left with its soldiers and settlers in 2005, but you can't in the West Bank, right? And Khalil Shikaki was saying that the number of those killed in the West Bank has actually been relatively low compared to previous periods, right? So, and you need the permission of your civilian counterparts, and you still have to deem it to be proportional, right? And so the U.S. uses some of these rules too, but in a much broader way when it comes to signature killings on the part of our administration, where we're not killing peoples whose names we know, but anybody between the ages of 20 or 30 that is in the wrong area. Maybe the presumption is, why would they be near a training camp in Pakistan if they're, up to any good, right? And so there's been criticism of that. And you basically, what I'm seeing is a continuing conversation with all these relatively new questions as to narrowing and defining the conditions under which something is deemed acceptable and deemed in accordance with international law. And it's not been resolved, right? There are continuing conversations about it. But a lot of people would say that these targeted killings would still be much less costly than military invasions, right? And we have, for instance, in the U.S. case, an example of Fallujah, right? In 2004, we had our U.S. Marines go in for a month-long operation. There were 6,000 Iraqis that were killed, 1,200 to 2,000 were militants, and the majority, therefore, were civilians, right? With 2/3 to 3/4, 10,000 buildings were destroyed, 60 mosques were destroyed that had that were harboring armaments in them, and the damage was deemed 25 times higher than the Israeli operation of Cast Lead in 2008, which was very costly in its own right. Right. So the question then becomes, as people turn to it, to what extent, was the military attainment of Fallujah, right, worth the cost? Is that proportional? Certainly in both countries they tried to warn civilians, to try to get them to leave their houses, etc., and a lot is done in order to minimize civilian casualties. Yet you have this intentional cost when people are hiding their arms and operating within civilian areas that in a sense handicap militaries to some extent, or certainly handicap the international perception of the legitimacy of that, which complicates these missions. Now, Israel itself has tried to do a lot, as does the U.S. and other countries. So, for instance, they have officer training. I talked to many of the people who do this. They have interesting computer simulations now for soldiers that put them in various different situations. And the impetus is to get them to ask certain questions about proportionality that then would be at least better, at least have the questions in the back of their mind when they're in the operating field. There are all kinds of things like that going on. After 2008, we have humanitarian officers that are part of missions trying to delineate what the effects on populations would be, right? So on one hand, you have this increasing effort on the part of many countries to try to have even greater visibility of international humanitarian law in the training of officers and soldiers. On the other hand, right, this is also limited because the nature of asymmetric wars gives a lot more discretion to individual commanders on the ground and how they would handle any particular situation, right? So on one hand, it makes it even more incumbent to train these people, but on the other hand, there's no one answer. It raises the question in terms of proportionality. It doesn't answer for you as a soldier what decision you should make, right, in assessing and weighing the cost of the military necessity and the potential collateral damage that comes about. So it's increasingly difficult. You also, by the way, have in the Israeli situation kind of differences among units, and some of the units which were more religious, there are a couple of them that seem to be answering more to rabbinic guidelines and so forth, as opposed to the purity of arms of the IDF that Pedazur mentioned yesterday in terms of the formation of the Haganah. So you have all these other complicating factors, even though there's a real effort to, in a sense, move towards restraint in this growing norm. But what makes these things even more difficult, right, is even measuring military effectiveness. How do you measure whether to have a ground invasion, how long to have it for, right? In Pillar Defense, the second war in 2012, apparently Ehud Barak, who was defense minister, wanted to stop the mission after 3 or 4 days. Tzipi Livni wanted to give it more time, right? How do you make these decisions as to what the goal is when the goal can never be victory? The goal is never military victory. So it's always a limited goal of diminishing the capacity of the enemy and allowing for some kind of temporary respite, and temporary calm is often the immediate goal. And in a sense, a lot of people argue that those goals are very militarily effective. One would argue since the 2006 war with Hezbollah has not, that perhaps Israeli deterrence has been successful, and you haven't had a real serious attempt on Hezbollah's part to challenge that since, right? But on the other hand, it's very difficult to measure, you know, the utility of having a temporary respite, right, from whether you deem that to be military successful, right? While within a year, either Hamas and Hezbollah can accumulate the same amount, or if not more, and more sophisticated arms than they had before. So do you define a military victory as a few months of relatively quiet and therefore protecting your citizenry, but while simultaneously you're enabling these organizations to have an even stronger capacity within a few months of the mission? How do you weigh that? And so on one hand, the more you damage the capacity of the group and you harm them because they have to hide, they have to now get new leaders, so there is definite damage that's done in the short term. But how in the world do you weigh that against potential recruits that are created from a ground invasion? It's a very difficult thing to do. You can't get numbers on that, and therefore the emphasis is usually on the short-term military gains as opposed to the longer-term potential military costs, which one can't quantify in any easy manner. You can try to quantify even how many Israeli lives are saved by getting some of these suicide bombers, and the Shin Bet, I've heard, tries to do that and has sometimes estimates of, for each person, 16 to 20 Israelis might be saved through getting a potential or suicide bomber in the main. So you can weigh potential lives saved, but you can't weigh kind of potential suicide bombers that are made through these actions. So it's just an extremely difficult situation. So what criteria do you use? I mean, one set of criteria that often I think are interesting to think about is David Baldwin is a scholar at Columbia who deals with economic statecraft. And he looks at, well, how do we know if economic sanctions are effective? Often people say economic sanctions work 30% of the time. So there are a lot of scholars that say they're ineffective. Well, he says, no, you can't necessarily just look at the figure of 30%, which, by the way, in baseball apparently would be very good, and compared to most tools is good, but you have to look at the alternative tools that you would use and how costly and effective they were. You have to look at even if the target state or non-state actor, in this sense, doesn't change their behavior, are you still sending a deterrent message to other potential groups? So, for instance, if you operate in Gaza, are you still sending a message to Hezbollah, for instance, and should you try to calculate that in any way? So he has a much more generous or loose criteria by which he finds something effective. And it's something to consider with this in terms of looking at the options in these kinds of asymmetric wars. But then what's even harder to do once we get through this, which is hard enough measuring the military effectiveness, is how in the world do you measure the political effectiveness? And would we be bold enough to say that in any of these four last wars that Israel has had with Hezbollah and Hamas, could we argue that any of them, most of them, none of them were politically effective, even though they did provide kind of a sense of calm for a temporary period? How would we define that? Okay, so one way to look at it is bringing it back to our earlier discussions yesterday morning about the peace agreement between Israel and the Palestinian Authority. What influence, if any, do these wars have on attempts to negotiate a broader agreement? Now, on one hand, might it say that Israel did not act or was not prioritizing restraint, perhaps, in its reaction to the Second Intifada, which was bloody and 1,000 Israelis died in weekly attacks, which in the American population would be about 40,000 people dying in weekly attacks. So again, the impetus in that situation is toward deterrence. Could one say, well, no matter what you think about the legality, morality, whatever is you are on the spectrum with that, could you say it was politically effective? Because Khalil Shikaki was talking to us yesterday morning about how Mahmoud Abbas, right, turned to nonviolence because he made the calculation that violence does not pay and is no longer in Palestinian national interest. Why? Because Israel actually, rather than conceding more land as a consequence of the Second Intifada, right, redeployed and took over some of the land it had withdrawn from. There were a lot of costs. There were costs to the Palestinian international support in the wake of a post-9/11 world, right? So perhaps could you argue that even that kind of strong measure of deterrence actually had some interesting positive political effects for the peace process? On the other hand, and maybe that's why we can't necessarily make generalizations or can question whether we can, right? In the aftermath of even pillar defense, we were talking yesterday about the closest apparently we've ever gotten to reaching a peace agreement in 2008 between Prime Minister Ehud Olmert and Abu Mazen or Mahmoud Abbas, right? And Shai Feldman was questioning why couldn't Arafat just, well, that was the previous negotiation in Clinton that he was talking about as well. But he was saying in these time frames where leaders are almost at the end of their tenure, why weren't they able to capitalize on actually reaching an agreement, right? And some would argue, right, that it was the pillar of defense war between Israel and Hamas during that potential period that perhaps played a role in weakening Mahmoud Abbas and making it less likely. It probably is not the primary reason, but perhaps it was a contributing reason to why he felt he couldn't move forward. I don't know, I'm raising that as a question in 2008. And therefore, you might look at the military success of the mission, but question its political effectiveness in a time when peace negotiations were being seriously negotiated. And it's interesting to see, okay, what is the political intention overall? Is it to weaken support for Hamas and therefore strengthen support for Fatah and Mahmoud Abbas, which are only the potential real partners to peace for Israel, since we all know Hamas rejects a two-state solution and supports terror tactics against Israel and so forth. So what is happening to support for Hamas? So according to Khalil Shikaki, right, both the pillar of defense and even more so the last protective edge actually increased support for Hamas, not only in the short term, but even more so in the longer term in the last war in the summer of 2014, and perhaps contributed to the situation today, which is quite depressing, I think, for many of us, that if election were held today without Marwan Barghouti, as he suggests, being a candidate, Hamas would win, right? So then you ask yourself, okay, well, what is the political effectiveness? Israel has no choice but to protect its citizens when there are tunnels being built to the dining rooms of kibbutzes and other things. So it's in a bind that it obviously has to react to protect its citizens, but in calculating in what manner and how long and to what extent to do it, right, you have to factor in to what extent is it going to strengthen or weaken in Hamas vis-a-vis Fatah, which is a real question. And secondarily, politically, it seems like one cannot ignore, right, the efforts internationally to delegitimize Israel and the effects that these wars have on that campaign, right? We all know we're at a college campus now. We know that the boycott, investment, and sanctions movement is moving rapidly from campus to campus across the United States. There are efforts internationally, even in the EU, to boycott goods from occupied territories, which I think one could have differing opinions of perhaps in certain segments, but what surprises me, and I think there is, what's even more disturbing is the issue of the Golan, because even though Itamar Rabinovich played a huge role in trying to achieve a land for peace agreement, which I fully admire and respect and support, right now in the current conditions, it seems we'd be hard put to punish Israel for not giving the Golan to al-Nusra, which is affiliated with al-Qaeda, which is near there now. I mean, there's no one to negotiate with in Syria now, and there's just no way in the current circumstances today that Israel could make a land for peace deal for Israel, yet the sense is to punish Israel for staying in the Golan right now. So you have this campaign to delegitimize Israel. And how does that play into measuring the political effectiveness of these wars, and how does that play out in the media? Right? As we all know, we would be hard put, I think, to argue that Israel did not lose the media wars in the last 3 wars between Israel and Hamas. And perhaps one could even argue, even though there are things it could do better, that it would be impossible for it to win these media wars, right? Why would that be, right? Number one, as we see the presses in hardship for money and firing their international support staff across the world, they rely more and more on local staff, and part of the ethos of the media is no longer trying to be balanced, but actually being an advocate for a side in a conflict and taking on that role intentionally, right? And there's more scholarship written about that. So now it becomes a real war of narratives played out through the media, and what you get farther and farther away from is the sense of proportionality that I outlined for you that exists in international humanitarian law, right? Where it's the subjective of the opinion of the military commander, in a sense, what's proportional. Now we're moving so far away from that that it's really arguably international public opinion that determines what proportionality is, which is starkly different from what it is in international law, right? So you have the media on one hand playing the advocate role. On the other hand, you have the natural sense that, of course, when you have civilians dying, people are going to be covering that, and there are going to be pictures of that, and that's what people are going to be highlighting. Right, so you have that sense as well. Now, how has Israel dealt with it, right? In the first war in 2008, it banned the media. It probably said, there's no way we can win the media war, we won't let the media go in. And that didn't necessarily produce better effects. So a couple of years later, or 3 years later, 2012, what it did is allow the media in the Pillar of Defense war. And some suggested that that was a preferable tactic, because then some of the journalists could at least see that some of the rockets were fired from civilian areas, et cetera, and possibly could complicate the narrative, which some of them did. But then what happened in this most recent, summer of 2014, of course, is you had the media there again, but a lot of them were threatened by Hamas, and Hamas wouldn't allow them, right, to take pictures of Hamas militants or to take pictures of firing rockets within civilian areas, or to question if something went off, whether it was an unexploded Hamas rocket that kind of misfired locally, or whether it was something coming from Israel. Right? So you have this almost impossible situation in which Hezbollah and Hamas are advantaged in these media wars in terms of what the narrative is. And I think that you can see that. I know in my own classes I often have simulations of peace negotiations, so before I do that, I assign my students opposite roles of the actors they're most empathetic with to try to get them to understand different perspectives. And so in doing that, I ask them what they know about the conflict, who they empathize more with and why. And usually I've had about a third split. So a third feel more empathetic to Israel, a third feel more empathetic to Palestine, and a third are kind of neutral, don't know much about it, don't have a real sense of that. Well, in the aftermath of the summer of 2014, that third of the class that I usually have who's more empathetic to Israel dropped significantly. And it was partly because of the war, but it's partly how the war was covered, right? Which is starkly how many killed on one side versus how many killed on others, with constant pictures of women, dead women and children, right? So this is the media war. Arguably can be handled better, but can't be won in any shape or frame. And part of the disadvantage is you have this instantaneous demand for information, and Israel will take a while to try to get the real facts out, whether it's the report of the massacre in Jenin in the Second Intifada, where it was reported that there were hundreds massacred, and later it was found out there were 50 killed and most were militants, whether it's in Kasled, where the UN came out and said their school was intentionally targeted by Israel, and then they apologized and retracted a few weeks later that no, Israel targeted militants who were shooting from across the street of the school but did not intend to hit the school. But a lot of that information comes out later. And most crucially, perhaps, in now the subjective decision as to what's the proportional that's now laid out in all of our laps across the world is to make that judgment ourselves, right, as opposed to holding to the definition of international law. You have the sense of this constant stream in all the media reports of how many militants are killed versus how many civilians are killed, and if there are more civilians that are killed, then obviously it's just proportional, right? But the real dilemma with all of this is no one knows how many civilians were killed. So often we don't bother to find out in a necessarily well-documented, transparent sense how many civilians are killed in Afghanistan or in Iraq or in Syria. And even with Israel, the Hamas numbers are given out, as they were in the summer of 2014, as the UN numbers, as the legitimate numbers. When often in the aftermath, right, in Kasled, there was a sense of, 2/3 or 3/4 are civilians dead, and then Hamas itself reported that they had 800 militants dead several months later, which was much closer to the Israeli figure from the beginning. And the problem with the news cycle is when something comes out a few weeks later, a few months later, nobody pays attention to it. So there are inherent problems with this. So I'll go towards the conclusion, which is this. I mean, these wars, arguably, you can't win militarily, and arguably, you can't win politically, right? So all you can do is respond to the initial domestic pressure and need to protect your civilians, right? But how you do that, the manner in which you do that, how you measure the effectiveness of doing that is ambiguous at best, right? Which to me calls, and that certainly doesn't mean that all militaries around the world can't continually strive to better their methods, to move to a greater extent towards restraint. Absolutely, all militaries around the world should continually try to strengthen these norms. But given that, there are limits to what you can do, and you're handicapped intentionally by these groups in doing it, which to me goes back to the beginning of our session yesterday morning and to Asher Schlusser's lecture yesterday evening as well. Well, how does this relate to the peace agreement or potential need for peace agreement? To me, the real challenge and difficulty of these wars point to the real necessity, right, of getting to an agreement, a peace agreement with the Palestinian Authority, because otherwise it's just a matter of time. Is it going to be another 2 months? Is it going to be another 2 years before you have one of these wars? What is going to be its effect? Is it going to have a negative effect on a potential peace agreement with Fatah? Is it going to lead to even increased international delegitimization of Israel, which more and more is seen as impacting its security interests and national interests? So this, to me, makes it urgent, despite all the obstacles that were talked about yesterday, to actually reach an agreement. And as I was trying to point to yesterday, it's been such a bleak picture, and it is a bleak picture, but I tried to muster some of the positives that are there in terms of reaching an agreement. And one of the things I point to is before the Oslo negotiations and the Oslo agreement, hardly any scholars and commentators predicted that there would be an Oslo agreement. Hardly anybody. It was quite the opposite. And then afterwards, right, there was this clamor in terms of all the conditions that Shai Feldman talked about. Oh, it was overdetermined. You know, disintegration of the Soviet Union, aftermath of the Gulf War, weakening of the PLO, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Of course we would have Oslo. But before that, the environment was just almost as bleak, perhaps, as it is today. Maybe not quite, but it was deemed as pretty bleak. So what are the underlying conditions, as I quickly mentioned in a question yesterday, that might give us some hope? Well, what gives us hope is there's a greater sense of forming a coalition of balancing Iran, right? So that we have lots of potential partners who support the framework of a two-state solution, which I think has only gained greater legitimacy in the last 10 years internationally by the EU, in the UN, and within the Arab League, that has now repeatedly, I think 3 times, supported the basis of a two-state solution. That's a dramatic difference that wasn't there during the time of hope in the 1990s, right? So this is something positive. I think Shai Feldman was correct in pointing out that there is a negative underlying condition, right, of this whole ISIS phenomena. The international community is absorbed with ISIS, appropriately so. The countries in the Middle East are absorbed domestically with fears of it, appropriately so. And that distracts from the urgency and attention that is given to Israeli-Palestinian negotiations. On the other hand, there's also a room for opportunity here, because you have all these countries that value to a greater extent the stability of Israel in this region and the urgency and need for stability of a Palestinian state living alongside Israel as a consequence of a peace agreement. Because if we don't get it, we just heard whatever, and I think Hillary Clinton mentioned in her speech in Saban, was it yesterday, that Israeli media reported that there was an ISIS commander in the Gaza Strip, right? So the potential, right, of continuing unraveling and instability in the Palestinian territories increases without an agreement. So one could galvanize this attention toward the need for an Israeli-Palestinian peace agreement. And the whole coalition that is formed with it, you could also look at the coalition that was formed in the aftermath of the first Gulf War, that can be capitalized in another area. And as we also heard yesterday, the parties themselves, in some ways, are closer than ever to knowing what an agreement would look like. In 2008, we were much closer than we were in the 1990s. So we more or less know what it looked like. So what is it? So the conditions are there, arguably, as they were before Oslo, in many respects. And what we're really thinking about is no one is seeing this as sufficiently urgent to actually make it happen. And it might fall on leaders, right, as Shai Feldman also talked about, to do this, right? And so to what extent might, although it's very unlikely, Obama would pay increased attention to this in his last year. I mean, it seems like he's completely given up. I don't think he mentioned this at all in his last UN statement. I think he gave one line to it in his last State of the Union statement. But maybe, since this was what he wanted to accomplish his first year in office, there might be a possibility, especially given all the flack that he is failing miserably in the Middle East in other ways, or isn't doing enough, or his polls on ISIS are extremely low. Perhaps there'd be an avenue for doing something, and if not, the new candidate, if you look at Daniel Kurtzner's work, that every administration wants to do something different as opposed to the prior administration in terms of Israeli-Palestinian peace. If the perception is that Obama gave up in his last 2 years of office, then perhaps the next president will be galvanized to do more. If you look at Israeli politics, perhaps Gantz, maybe would get, Lapid is now saying it's the priority, even though he didn't prioritize it before. Maybe there's room for new leadership. Perhaps Mahmoud Abbas in the right conditions would do something. And then if you can't get a full agreement, and this is where I think there might be some consensus among some of our speakers in the panel, if you look at what Khalil Shikaki said and Shai Feldman and Asher Susser yesterday, is that it shouldn't be all or nothing, perhaps. You should, I think galvanize, I kind of agree with Barak, you need a summit and do it and get an agreement, right? But if conditions are perceived as poor, and if there's no sense of urgency on the part of many of these actors and leaders, you have to do something in the interim because there's no status quo. It's going to keep getting worse. So what can you do? Right? Khalil Shikaki, pointed to some things. Maybe in Area C, you can allow economic investment. In other areas, you can allow greater Palestinian authority and security. And perhaps, right, what Asher Susser mentioned to us last evening is perhaps as a last resort, if we can't get serious negotiations going in the next couple of years, you turn back to Ariel Sharon's consideration, or actually commitment on his part to unilateral withdrawal, despite all the risks of that. But then you learn the lessons from Ariel Sharon's unilateral withdrawal, and at least do it with greater coordination and greater credit given to the PA, so that perhaps Mahmoud Abbas and Fatah can be strengthened vis-a-vis Hamas in a circumstance where Hamas is gaining greater popularity, right? So if unilateral withdrawal was done, to some extent, that you do it in a way, if you're not doing it in the midst of negotiations, to give greater credit to and potential greater popularity to Fatah, and try to breathe some more strength as a potential partner there. So I'm hoping that this lecture is kind of a transition between the initial conversations we had about the great challenges for getting a peace agreement, even though we have its urgency, and the next lectures, which will look at the Middle East more generally, and Syria and other actors in the Middle East in terms of the nature of these wars that play into it. So hopefully this is a good transition, and I'll take questions, comments, critiques, and hopefully we have some time for discussion.